Here we go. So good evening. Galen. This is February the 28th. Who would have thought that the first 2 months of the year would go by so quickly, but they have. We had an interesting call with corporate last night. And tonight's call, as advertised, we'll have a discussion about stress, the good, the bad, and the ugly of stress. So without taking too much time away from the speakers, why don't we have either Ken or Ron chime in with their, basic statement and get the discussion going.
I might start off.
Okay.
Basically, just to sort of summarize where we've been so far. So we've talked about the evils of sugar and excessive carbs, and the beauty of Emulin for treating that. I'd like to try to keep bringing this back to Galen because that's why we're here. We talked about fat, toxicity. This week we're talking about stress. Next week we're talking about exercise. And so those are some major factors in our well-being. And some solutions are free, dealing with stress, exercise, things like that. And it's unfair to expect Emulin or Climax or some of those assistant substances to perform miracles if we're not doing this other stuff. So that's just the basis, I think, at which we should start. So Ron, what have you got for us?
Well, I think you're right. And we've kind of been talking really all about it, and you just alluded to it very strongly about what is stress and where does it come from, I guess is a good thing to kind of look at. And we're all dealing with stress on a daily level. I mean, when we wake up in the morning, if we wake up, so the person who doesn't wake up, they got the stress of losing a partner or whatever. We're dealing with stressors. But I think the thing that gets missed quite often is that food is a huge stressor. And that's something we do 2, 3, 4 times a day. And people who are snacking in between time are having even a little more stress. But stress can become an environmental impact. It can become by what we're putting on the fork and putting in our body. John just talked about it a minute ago. Sleep is an important thing that helps to relieve stress. Exercise is critically important. So we need to really look at all of them. And I think relaxation, and a lot of people don't relax enough. And there's so much in our lives. There's so many distractions in our lives. Just to be here on this call is stressful. I mean, I know it's stressful for Ken. It's stressful for me to put together good information that'll help everyone take their health level to the next notch up. We all want to do it. And then we've got stressors of, well, we can't get a hold of so-and-so, or all these things are all little stressors. But boy, the first thing I always think about is our food, because that's what I love to talk about. So what kind of foods are really stressors? And I kind of listed maybe a few, and we already talked about them, but number one, sugar. Starches, carbohydrates. Gluten is another huge one. We don't really need to talk that much about sugar. We know a lot about that. Gluten is really an important one. And it's an important one to me because it really killed my mother, literally. She starved to death at age 56 years of age because of a gluten and wheat intolerance. And it destroyed the microvilli in her intestinal tract. Now, that's a huge stressor on the body. So we need to really eliminate those things as much as possible to eliminate that stress. And most of us know by now that the gut is the second brain. So that's very important to understand. If we have we have that gut feeling, or we can feel stress in our guts first, because when something coming that's stressful, or we come across an accident, let's say, right away you feel it in your gut. Or if somebody says, I'm going to do this to you, you feel it in your gut. So the gut is really critically important. So that's a really important thing. And then just processed foods in general are key things that are really stressors on our body. So, what do we do about it? And Ken, why don't you maybe take off on that a little bit, or add to what I just said, if you will.
You just set me up perfectly. when I'm dealing with patients, and I deal with a lot of people who are very stressed and don't really even know it, I ask them what's going on in their life. And I have a page bookmarked in Guyton's physiology book, which is a kind of a huge book of physiology. I photocopied it, and I'll just flash it up here. You won't be able to read it, but this is a list of the effects of stimulation of the autonomic nervous system. Now, I hope I'm not getting too scientific for people, but I'll dumb it. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'll simplify it as much as I can. The autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that runs you automatically. It dilates your eyes, it secretes your juices, it blinks, makes you blink without thinking, you breathe without thinking. So that's kind of they often call it automatic part of your nervous system. Now, it is arbitrarily divided into two sections, a sympathetic part and a parasympathetic part. The sympathetic part is your fight or flight reaction when you get scared, startled, like you mentioned, Ron. Parasympathetic is, I always say to people, that's the cat sleeping on the windowsill on a nice sunbeam and not bothered by anything. Now, in the parasympathetic state, that's when you're healing and rebuilding your body. In the sympathetic state, that's when you're running away from something, you're protecting yourself. And as one great cell biologist said, you cannot defend and build at the same time. So one side is for defense, the other side is for building. So if you're under sympathetic stimulation, if you're stressed for too long, you break down, and that's a big problem. And you mentioned gut, and I'll go here to gut. So under sympathetic stimulation, pupils dilate, the nasal glands constrict, sweat glands cause sweating. Let's go down to the gut. The gut decreases peristalsis, the sphincters increase their tone. Gallbladder is inhibited, bile ducts inhibited, and we got inhibition a lot of the way, and then we got increased blood coagulation, all the things that would protect us. So Ron, when you said you feel it in the gut, you do feel it in the gut, because you're feeling a neurological change happen in your body. And you're right when you're saying we are a little bit stressed when we're trying to present this. I feel my face flushing a little bit. I feel my eyes dilating a bit. And that's just my intensity with trying to do that. And it's a little bit of sympathetic stimulation. Now, if we're in balance, of course, that's fine. But one of the problems that we have is people get sympathetic dominant. I've had many patients who, I'll give an example. We have one woman who, boy, it's two examples in one, actually. She was a teenager in Saskatchewan, a young teenager, 12, 13, and her younger brother drowned in a pond on their farm, and she took responsibility for that at age 12 or 13 and has been stressing about it ever since. She's never forgiven herself. And so she looks like a frightened deer. And at the least noise, the least anything, we all know people like that. They're jumpy, they're agitated. And so they're sympathetic dominant, and they're shutting down these vegetative mechanisms by which they heal. And those are a lot of the people that get sick. Contrary, the parasympathetic, I've only had one patient who was parasympathetic dominant, and he was a heavy meditator. And he came to me asking, he had a problem where he passed out, and they wanted to put a pacemaker in. He meditated a lot, and his heart rate was so slow, and his blood pressure was so slow. He was so chilled out that they were worried about his health. And he asked me what I should do, and I told him to rent a few Schwarzenegger movies just to stimulate that other side. If only it were so easy the other way. So you got anything to add to that, Ron?
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. I've got a chart here. Hans Selye is the guy who and I've mentioned him before on this. He discovered what stress was. I've got his book here, ancient book called The Stress of Life. That came out in the 60s. but it hasn't been bested yet. And he sacrificed a lot of rats. He put them through hell to see what stress did to the body. And his definition is the stress response is common to any insult. So whether you're burned or frozen or eat the bad things or ingest a poison, get threatened, whatever, your body does the same thing. And it's this stress response that I just spoke of in Guyton's physiology. You can only sustain that stress response for a limited amount of time. Here's a chart. I don't know whether that will show or not. You can see that there's a kind of a line. It dips at the beginning, it rises up, and then it drops off. And that is the effect of a sustained stress response. So what happens, and we've all experienced that, we have a car turn in our lane, or we have something that startles us, we actually dip a little bit, and then we rise into this sympathetic response. We can sustain that for a period of time, but not forever, after which we begin to exhaust. And that's an endocrine and neurological function, a gland and hormone and nervous system function, where you become exhausted, and that's when chronic degenerative illness comes in. That's when we're vulnerable to those things. And at the end point of exhaustion is death. And that's what Selye found. The only other thing that I'll add is that stressors are cumulative. So those foods that you talked about, Ron, and the ugly workplace that you have, as I often say, that stress response is great for running away from bears, but it's no good at all from running away from lawyers, bad bosses, uncooperative spouses.
That's funny.
No place for a stress response, right?
So Ken, if I can just interject for a minute, when I read that book many, many years ago when I was doing some psychology courses, I distinctly remember that Selye also is the one that talked about eustress, EU stress, which was the positive side of stress, because unless you are stressed, you're really dead. So maybe you can talk about that to give people some hope that there's another side to this ogre called stress.
Well, there are positive stressors, and the interesting thing is the body response is often similar, but the mental response is different. He used an example of a woman who discovers that her son has been lost in a war, and that knock on the door happens, and she gets the terrible news. And she goes through a terrible, terrible stress response. And then 2 weeks later, there's a knock on the door, and it's her son. He wasn't lost. He's made it. He's home. Her stress response is the same. So part of what we want to talk about today as well is how to manage that stress response, how to select the good stressors. We know that exercise is a stressor. We're going to talk about that next week. It's a positive stressor. Selye also talks about stress versus distress. And so we can waste an awful lot of energy distressing about things. And we'll talk about this. Does that bring up anything, Ron?
Yeah, I just kind of I put a little list together of some of the systems in our body that really are affected by stress. And I'm going to just read them off here. Central nervous system and endocrine system is a system that's affected by stress. The respiratory system and cardiovascular system also affected by stress. The digestive system, the gut, back to the gut again. The muscular system. When I say muscular, I always think about when a farmer's out in the field and something happens, or let's say there's a car wreck and there's somebody pinned underneath the car. There are people or a group of people that can lift a car that there's no way in the world they could possibly lift. But the adrenal glands kick in and they can lift that car. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to destroy the vertebrae and crush all the things in the back. But for that moment, they're getting that shot of adrenaline to be able to perform under stress. So that's kind of a good thing, bad thing. And then there's our sexuality and reproductive system, also affected by stress. And of course, our immune system. So those are the really key 6 parts of our body systems that are affected by stress, either negatively or positively. And usually, pretty much it's a negative situation. So we've got to do some things about it. So maybe you want to take off on that, or I can give you a little list of foods that help to prevent stress.
I just want to come in on that for a minute. So in life, stuff happens. I wanted to say something else, but stuff happens. And it's going to happen to every one of us. And it's how you react and what you do with it that determines the damage or the effectiveness of your life going forward. So if you're under the control of every event that happens, rather than control of your own intellect and your own ability to react appropriately, that's where you have some challenges. So if you think about anything that's happened terribly in your life, or anything that's imminent right now, there's another way of it could have been handled. There's another way you could react it. You didn't have to react instantly to exacerbate it. So the current example is Mr. Tweethead in the U.S. Presidency. Everything that he sees on Fox becomes a tweet that gets him further into scandal. It's not that other presidents didn't have stuff happen, but they had measured responses rather than just being, in the reptilian brain, as it were. Go ahead and comment on that, Ken.
Well, that's very interesting because part of it I refer to as mental hygiene.
Yeah.
And they don't have mental floss. You have to do it yourself. So and there's a lot of little tricks about that.
Okay.
And I can go into them. Fear, which is genuine, which stimulates that fight or flight response, is in the present. So somebody pulls out in front of you, you have fear, you secrete that the stress hormones, the norepinephrine and adrenaline and all of those ones. Your eyes dilate, you go through that whole response. You secrete pro-inflammatory corticosteroids in case you get injured. And that puts you into the stress response, but it's a good thing because you're going to try to save yourself. Now, where people get into trouble, for instance, is we all know people who worry. And people who worry try to prepare themselves for the future by imagining what bad things might happen. And unfortunately, the brain or the body doesn't know the difference between what you imagine and what you experience. So a lot of people that worry put themselves into a stress response based on their own thoughts. And they really should create their own mental hygiene. Anxiety is future. Anxiety is in the future. You're worried about the future. Guilt is in the past. Neither of those are in the present. The only place that you can act is in the present. Regret, the same as above. Thoughts, when you have those thoughts, what they do is they trigger a chemical response, right? So you have that stress response. You squirt out some hormones that produce all these changes. The thing is, you can't take them back. You have to metabolize them. And for really highly stressed people, what they do is before they finish metabolizing the stress hormones from the last response, they do another one and then another one. And so they're constantly jacked up. And that's where Ron's going to help us with some ideas about food.
That is so good what you just added. And I just want to touch on one other thing, that just to amplify your point about fear. I've always taught that if you write fear vertically, F-E-A-R, fear is false evidence appearing real. So all the worry about imagined events, 99% of them will never occur. You've just given your power away to something that will never happen. And so most of the time, there's no need to be afraid of what's happening because it hasn't happened yet.
That's correct.
Be afraid when it happens. Deal with it then appropriately, but do not give away your power to fear, worry, anxiety, and the stuff that you just mentioned. One other quick little note, and all of us who've been around a year or two, know that whether it's in relationships with others or in relationship with yourself, the need to be right is the chief form of self-sabotage, both in relationships with others and with yourself. So when you are in an argument or when you're in a discussion and you've got two opposing points of view, ask yourself, what's in it for me to be right at this moment? You know, do I need the aggravation? Do I need to impose this stress and this anger in the other person or in the situation? Do I need that? Is it going to give me anything? What's in it for me? And you may decide to be more gracious and say, I think you might be right. And just walk away. Who cares who's right in that instance? You may know that you're right and it's cool. You don't need to win one over the other person, because if you do, you know that they will have residual resentment towards you. So what did you gain by being right? So the need to be right is the chief form of self-sabotage and relationship sabotage. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think, Ron, if you can give us your list of foods and things to help ourselves, I will then give a few ideas about mental hygiene and just some thoughts to control what goes on in your head. How about if we do that?
That sounds good. You know, it's interesting, though, before I go to the good foods, when we're under stress, what is our normal thing to do? We go for the comfort foods. You know, the bowl of ice cream or the hot fudge sundae or the glass of beer, a glass of wine, or a piece of cake or a Twinkie or whatever the case may be. Hopefully never a Twinkie, but so, you know, it's those things that just are going to add to our stress. Maybe not right at the moment, but down the road, it's going to do that, because what it's going to do is it's going to create, now I'm going to take it back to Galen, it's going to create more inflammation, and more inflammation causes more stress. So it's a vicious cycle. In fact, I've heard many people tell me, they say, you know, when you read my death certificate, ignore what they say is the reason for my death. What it's going to say on my tombstone is stress.
Yes.
Because all of those things add up to all the diseases that we can die from.
And we're pushing our happy button with those bad foods and trying to raise our dopamine level. And now we have something else that does that.
Exactly. So just here's 10 foods that I think can really help. Now, it's probably not going to be your first thing to think of when you're under stress, but green leafy vegetables. So why deep green leafy vegetables? Well, they're rich in folate. Well, if you look at what folate is part of the B complex of things. And then we can look at organic turkey breast. Now, turkey contains L-tryptophan. And anybody knows that after the holidays, like Thanksgiving here, you make this big turkey, and about an hour later, where's everybody? Sitting in the back room sleeping. Well, what is that? It's the L-tryptophan in large part. Now, it could also be that you followed up that turkey with a great big piece of fruit pie, and that fruit is fermented in about 20 minutes because it digests real quickly. And it goes back to the food layering I talked about last week, or the week before maybe. You know, that's going to ferment, and then that's going to cause you to become inebriated by eating fruit because the turkey's in the way and it's not letting it all go through. So that's another little sidebar there. But turkey is really a good thing, turkey breast, for that reason. Fermented foods, and that goes back to our gut again. So one of the things that's really, really good is yogurt. In fact, Donna makes a raw goat milk yogurt. We get a gallon every week. We have a goat share. So we make yogurt every single day. And right before this call, every week, I have a dish of yogurt, which is good. So there are times when we don't eat quite perfectly. And even if I'm out for the evening and I have we got a party we're going to, and we have a little cake or ice cream, usually I'll forget the ice cream because I know that really messes with me and plugs up my sinuses, and I'm going to pay for it in a big, big way. But the piece of cake, maybe not so much. So, but I'll come home and I'll have a little dish of yogurt to get that good bacteria in the gut to counterbalance the junk that I put in. So fermented foods is really a key thing for a lot of good reasons. You can dig this all up. There's a good website to go to. Just look up, the title of it was 10 Best Foods to Eat for Stress. You go and look that up and Google it, you'll find it. And it's pretty informative. In fact, I got 3.5 pages here of all written out information, which I'm not going to get into detail, but wild-caught salmon. So why the wild-caught salmon? Because that's got the omega-3, which is really good, and EPA and DHA, very helpful for the body in terms of balancing things out. We go to blueberries, high in antioxidants, very, very important. Then we go to pistachios, and pistachios are really, really beneficial for the body as well. Good fats, that's really what we're talking about, and we got to go back sometime to the good fat, bad fat, because we didn't really get into the depth on that a few weeks back either. But dark chocolate is another one, and I don't mean M&Ms. So forget about that. If you're thinking M&Ms, that's not the right thing. And I remember, this is a little interesting thing that just popped into my mind. If you remember Ronald Reagan, he always had on his desk M&Ms.
That's right.
What did Ronald Reagan wind up with?
Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes.
Yeah.
So, but 100% cacao chips, wonderful. In fact, I had just a little, well, it's a peanut butter, oatmeal, honey, and cacao chip ball. They're no bake. They're wonderful. You have 1 or 2 of those every single day. It's a good little treat, very beneficial. And then sunshine. Oh boy, I'll tell you, we don't get a lot of that here in the winter because in West Michigan, other than Seattle, Washington, we're the second cloudiest spot in North America. So today it was sunny and we went for a walk, and our faces are already getting a little sun on them because we're out there all the time in the sun. And of course, walking is such a good one to relieve stress. But seeds, again, are very, very important to be putting in our body. Pumpkin seeds is a real good one. Avocados is a really nice thing to be putting in the body as well because of the fats in there. So those are the 10 listed foods that I found just real quickly in a quick search of what are beneficial. You want to read the detail, go to the website and just look at it because it's really, really important. And if you eat your whole lifestyle that way, we're going to be able to handle those stresses that are going to come our way. We're going to, tomorrow we're supposed to have snow again. Well, we haven't had snow for a long time. All the snow is gone, even the piles are gone. But tomorrow I'm going to probably have to get the shovel out. That's another stressor. Fortunately, the sun's going to come up the next day and it'll be gone. But so that's just my comment on how we really need to deal with stress from a dietary point of view. It's very, very important. Sleep, exercise, we're going to go into that, but very critical as well.
Okay, I'll complement that with my list. I'm gonna compete with my list, Ron. I've got about eight things that border on mental hygiene, or 8 thoughts towards mental hygiene, and things that you can do that are positive that eliminate stress in your life. And they take practice. And most people don't think they're going to work, but they do. The first one is meditation. And by meditation doesn't mean you have to be cross-legged chanting a mantra. Meditation is any activity where you lose track of time and you're relaxed and you're where you want to be, and your thoughts can just still themselves. There was a study done with meditators compared with non-meditators where they put them all on biofeedback, showed them a workers' compensation movie in which you could see a fellow doing something very wrong with a saw, and it was going to be a grisly accident happening. And they tracked the activities of the nervous systems of the meditators versus the non-meditators. The meditators actually dropped a little bit in their finding. Their heart rate dropped as they saw that something was going to happen. And when that accident happened, they jumped to a higher level of awareness and state of fight or flight. They jumped to a higher state than the other people. But when the accident was over, you could see them drop themselves down. Their breathing changed and they forced themselves back down, whereas the non-meditators took forever to get back to normal. So that's one of the beauties of meditation. You can begin to control that fight or flight response. Breathing is a second one. It's something that we take for granted. I just happen to have a great book here. It's called Breatheology. The guy's a world champion free diver, can hold his breath for over 17 minutes. And in there are some breathing exercises, and I do them at traffic lights. You belly breathe in first, and then let your chest rise up. Hold your breath until you feel oxygen hunger. Release it from your chest and then your belly. Hold it again until you feel oxygen hunger. Repeating that a few times is amazingly relaxing, and you get almost a bit of a head rush with that oxygen, and you probably realize that you've been breathing shallow, which is what a lot of stress people do. You have control to a degree of your environment. You can avoid stressful places. You can avoid stressful entertainment. I don't know, I just don't understand why people watch horror films, murder films, all of this stuff, and put them, so their body doesn't know. And so those are stressors, and they add on to that pile. A very interesting one is forgiveness. And I learned that in spades from Dr. Tom Iwama, who used to do some different health talks. He was from Okinawa, and he would always finish his talk saying, people ask me why people from Okinawa live so long. And he said, they ask, is it the coral calcium? Is it the fish diet? Is it whatever? And he said, no, it's that Okinawans have a principle of forgiveness. You never go to bed having not forgiven everything from that day. He said, if you don't, we call it holding a stone in your heart. And too many stones in your heart will kill you. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And Ron, I know you're a Christian, and that is the lesson of Jesus, is forgiveness. And if we can adopt that lesson, we will be a lot less stressed. Doing nothing. Is there such a thing as doing nothing? I always wanted to write a book about doing, not doing, and undoing, because so many people are doing so much, they end up having to undo what they did. And if they just sat there and done nothing for a bit, they wouldn't have done it in the first place. And so we have a couple of swivel rockers, and we're fortunate to have a beautiful view. And I have a cushion on the windowsill for my feet. And there is significant time spent with feet on the windowsill, staring out, maybe some ducks swimming by. We have seals swimming in front of our place occasionally, whatever. It's just not doing anything. And that's very, very unstressful. And it allows your body to return. Doing positive. I've got a friend, he's a Nova Scotian, Brian. And he is the most helpful guy. When in any circumstance, he'll hold the gate open for you. He looks for how he can help other people. And he does so much positive, and it adds positive to him. And so helping other people is a very positive thing. And one of the ones that I feel strongly, and there were books by an old hippie by the name of Ken Keyes. He wrote very many books, but they all said the same thing, is that we form a picture of the world in our head and how the world should be. People should be honest. People shouldn't pull out in front of me in front of traffic. People should use their signal lights or whatever. People shouldn't charge me too much for certain things. And so we form this view of our world. And then when people don't do those things, we get upset. But in fact, we're getting upset at our own preconceptions. So whenever I am disappointed with a circumstance or a person or a situation, the first question I ask is, well, who appointed me? If I'm disappointed, who appointed me? And it's always me. And so I think learning that lesson allows you to accept circumstances with a minimum of stress. You got anything for me after that, Ron?
Well, you alluded to the fact that I'm a Christian, and that's a fact. And Billy Graham just passed away, and I think that's one of the great lessons in life. He said, God loves you. And I think just knowing that, for me, it's daily reading the Word. And if you haven't done it recently, pick up the book of Matthew and look in Matthew and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. I think it's just a powerful testimony that kind of addresses everything we've been talking about. And then prayer, to communicate with him. I mean, prayer ceaselessly, it says. and Timothy. So I think that's very important as well. You know, you talk about breathing, Ken, and I want to just jump on that a minute too. When we're walking, what I'll do often, and especially as I'm coming to this monster hill that we're going up at the end of our 4.5 mile walk, is I really get into some nice deep breathing. But I'll take about 5 steps while I'm inhaling through my nose, filling my lungs and feeling them expand, and then releasing it through the mouth very slowly, the same number of steps, and it's usually about 5. And boy, I'll tell you, that calm you down, and where you start to feel tight in the gluteus maximus going up those hills, boy, I'll tell you, does that ever release that, and you just breeze right up the hill. So breathing deeply. Now, when most of us, or a lot of us, are sitting at computers all day, and when I'm sitting at the computer, I have to mentally think. I'm working on my keyboard, but my lungs are compressed, so I'm not doing much deep breathing. So every now and then, you just got to kind of sit back, take a deep breath in, and do some deep breathing. It'll clear your mind. It'll feel refreshing. And it's just amazing what those simple things that you said in the very beginning are free. We can do that cost nothing. So I think that's a good point.
I just want to add something to what you said, Ken, about who appointed you. I've had an expression that I've used for a long time. When I hear somebody say, you should do this, you should do that, whatever, or I should do this, or I say, don't should on yourself.
Yeah.
Don't should on yourself.
You're shitting all over me.
You're shitting all, yeah, don't should on yourself, because, you know, that just doesn't accomplish anything. The other one that always gets me is people who say, you have to do this, or, you know, I have to do this. No. There's no have to. I can choose to. I choose to. You choose to. There's no, whenever it's a have to or a should, instantly you go into resistance. And what you resist persists. So whatever you're in resistance to, I'll give you an example. All my young life as a teenager and a young adult and whatever, I was in resistance to my mother.
Look what you got.
So for those of you that don't know, I'm now for 2.5 years, literally the day-to-day caregiver for my 92-year-old mother with dementia. And it literally keeps me a prisoner in my own house to the degree that I have to be here for everything. So what you resist persists. Let go of the things that, you know, usually what you resist reminds you way too much of what you are like yourself. When I used to be in resistance to my father, after I made peace with it, I saw that I became exactly like him. It's just shocking. And where the breakthrough came is way back in the 80s. I was privileged to do some courses similar to EST, the Forum, Renaissance. You guys have all heard of those. And there was an exercise where you were asked to describe your relationship with your mother and father, and, you know, whether it was happy or not, whatever. And so they played a song first about father, and it just brought you to tears. And they said, look, while you're listening to that song, think about your father when he was a child growing up through his life with his parents, with his circumstances, with his training, his education. Do the same with your mother. And as you're listening to that song with that frame, man, the tears just come. And then you come to the realization that all the resistance you have about they're not doing it the way they should, they're not the best. They are doing the best that they knew how. If they would have known how to do it better, don't you think they would have wanted to? So give them some space. And then by implication, you're going to give yourself some space to not be so hard on yourself when you're not perfect. So what you resist persists. And, you know, the mother, father, it's really important for many of us. If you have any issues still with your parents, you know, with whatever age you are, find a way to get that. And one great person that I just want to bring in on this is Debbie. Debbie, why don't you chime in with your emotional release for a minute, because that's a big stressor.
You know, if you ask me to chime in for a minute, you're going to get 15.
I know.
I've had so many thoughts come up as we're going through this, and the one thing, the recent with the breathing, is I teach Tai Chi, and before I start teaching the classes, I teach people. I say, you know, and remember to breathe while you're doing the movements, and people just think that's funny. But then I teach them how to breathe. I have them put one hand on their chest and one hand on their belly, and I say, and I don't tell them why, and I ask them to breathe in and then breathe out. And then I ask them, when you breathe in, which hand goes up? And if the upper hand goes up, they're dealing with the top part of their lungs, which actually triggers the sympathetic part of the nervous system. Whereas if you can push your belly out, which is something that's foreign to women, right? We're always tucking ourselves in. But if you push your belly out when you breathe in, it forces the air to come deeper into the lungs. You get more oxygen that way, and you're also stimulating the parasympathetic side of the nervous system. So that in itself is a good relaxation technique if people are stressed. I was actually first on site after a car accident, and there was a gal, she'd been taken into the house where she had her accident, and she was on the couch, and she was absolutely in panic mode. She was in trauma. She didn't know what had happened. Well, she knew she'd been in an accident, but she thought her legs were cut off, and they weren't. So she's lying on this couch, and she's just panting, just fast breathing. And so I went in, and I put my hand on her belly, and I said, breathe in and push up my hand. And it took her a little while to calm down and do it, but as soon as she did it, it just brought her down to reality, and it took her out of that, she was in that trauma stress. And so it does really help that calming. So that's something anybody can do anytime. And John, what you said just at the end there, I had a training years ago with a group, and the title of it was, "What you are is where you were when." In other words, exactly, your parents are how they are because of what they were as they were growing up. And that's where it kind of gets into the emotion. I do trapped emotion release, and wow, so many things popped into my head as we're talking about this, because we go through life triggered by the experiences of our past. And, people will go to psychiatrists and psychologists to try and get over this and learn how to deal with it. But if you can actually remove that trapped ball of energy that's blocking the meridian system, everything can change. Because if your meridians are not open, which 99% of the people walking around aren't, or at least some of them, it blocks that whole energy circuit to every system. And Ron, you were talking about the systems in the body. Well, every system is governed by meridian energy. And if those meridians are shut down, all of your systems don't have energy. Again, when we were talking about toxicity and doing the liver cleanse, and my internet kind of went bad, so I couldn't chime in, but if you can open up the liver meridian, the liver's then going to be able to actually work properly. The lung meridian allows the lungs to do their detoxing. So underlying all of these solutions is get the meridian system open so your body can actually do what it's supposed to do. And Ron, you said about the gut being the second brain, and that's one of the first things I tell my patients is, or I ask them, when you get bad news, where do you feel it? And it's always like right in the gut. And I said, well, that's one of the things, things that shuts down the meridians. It's a stressor of some kind. It can be emotional stress, it can be physical stress, or it can be nutritional stress. And the stomach meridian is responsible for more than the other meridians in the body. It's like the granddaddy, the stomach and the liver. And they're blocked on every single patient that I see, unless I've worked on them before and released them. But getting those negative, people think emotions from stressors are just thoughts and feelings, but they're actually physical balls of energy that get stuck somewhere in the body, up to the size of a baseball. And if they're stuck across an energy line, it's, the energy can't flow anymore, and then systems start to fail because they can't help it. They go to chiropractic for, their muscles are feeling weak, or they're not breathing right. To physiotherapy, and they'll be told to do this exercise or that exercise. But if they have no meridian flow going to the muscles that require that action, all it does is fatigue them even more. So yeah, I mean, I could do a whole call on this, and I guess I probably will.
There's that brought up something that I used to teach. I used to teach stress reduction courses.
Yeah.
And if I was blessed with a blackboard, I would ask the group, what makes you happy? And of course, a lot of people would say family. So I'd write down family. Money makes me happy. Ice cream makes me happy. Sex makes me happy. I don't know, getting cards in the mail makes me happy. So we did do this big long list of things that makes people happy. And then one by one, I would say, erase them. And then I would say, how do you feel now? Oh, I'm not very happy anymore. And we'd go through that until there weren't any happy things left. And then I would ask if anybody had any thoughts about that. And once in a while, I'd be blessed with a person who said, you know what, you're making your happiness dependent on other things.
Mm-hmm.
And happiness is actually independent. Happiness is a choice. I learned that very well during, there was the people were fleeing from the genocide in Cambodia, from Pol Pot. And I saw on the news these people fleeing, and yet children were playing in the water in the ditch. They were happy. They found a way to find happiness. And so if you can keep happiness as a state of mind, you're already erasing a lot of stress. And so for everybody, just remember that happiness is a choice. You can choose to be happy or you can choose to be unhappy. Just don't make your happiness equal to other stuff.
Could I add a bit to that?
Sure.
Sometimes people don't get the choice. Okay. They don't have that choice because of the triggers. You spoke about triggers before. And when the body experiences a traumatic event, whatever age, even before you're born, that can remain stuck in your body as a trapped emotion. And so you were talking about how, every time there's a knock on the door, it triggers that same response because that's attached to an event. But those can be removed. And so sometimes, as much as people want to think they cannot, respond to something because they're going to talk themselves out of it, they've got that actual emotional trigger and that creates a physical response in their body. And so getting rid of that can make an enormous difference to people.
So Debbie, you and I were talking the other day about you maybe giving us a guest appearance in 2 or 3 weeks to talk about this whole emotional release and meridians. Are you still up for that?
What do you think? I'm a little passionate about it because it gets to the underlying cause of so many things rather than just, the Band-Aids on the top.
Sounds good.
So,
listen, let's give our guests a chance to interact and ask any questions because we've been 45 minutes or so. So if you're curious and want to ask any question or make a contribution, why don't you unmute yourself and chime in? And let me put everybody up so you can see one another. Here we go. So you can see who's here. So who's got a question or comment? Really? Nobody? We were talking to dead air? Come on, you guys.
I was just wondering if you're talking about Touch for Health, Debbie. Is this like reflexology?
No, it's not quite that. I started out with Touch for Health. That's kind of what got me on the path. This is actually addressing emotions when they got trapped in the body, how old they were, where they are physically in the body. You can actually determine where an emotion is trapped. And then it can, it can actually be released. So it's different than Touch for Health, but it's kind of related because it deals with meridians. The other thing that people are if they're interested in the tapping, if you've seen the tapping solution, they just started Monday night. They do 2 sessions every night, and you just tap along with the points. Tapping is wonderful because it also does get you in touch with the meridians. They're actually tapping on endpoints for meridians. when they're doing that. They're just doing it with, with intentional language and that. I'm not sure that physically releases the trap ball of energy that might be creating, but it does help open meridians. Lots of things help open the meridians. It's just that they will block again, because I've worked on meridians for 22 years, and it would be nice, to just get rid of them and then they're done. But they would come back in 2 weeks, and some of them would be blocked again, because you can open them. It's like, opening up that cruddy pipe, and it'll open for a while and then it gets corroded again and closes. So if the emotions will actually open it much, much more permanently, I guess.
When you're talking about the meridian, oh, sorry, Ron. When you're talking about the meridians, are you talking in the same vein as chakras?
No, no.
Okay.
The chakra system is different. Those are energy centers in the body. Yeah. The meridians are circuits. You've got 6 running down your arm, 3 running down, connecting with another 3 that come up. There's another, 3 that go down the body head to toe, and another 3 that come back up. So they're circuits of electricity. Basically, it's like, I tell my patients, it's like the wiring in your house. And if you go to your breaker box and you turn off some switches, something's not going to work right.
Yeah,
and
because the tapping that you're talking about, they're starting to find out that working with children, younger children that have ADHD, FAS and FDS, it really, really helps to center them and bring them down.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's great for kids. I know Nick and Jessica Ortner, our brother and sister team, who do the tapping solution, and this is their 10th anniversary this year. And like Louise Hay and Dr. Wayne Dyer did it. Dr. Mark Hyman is a big fan of it. Dr. Mercola. These people are people who, know what's going on, and they see this. And at first it feels strange because you're tapping these points and you're saying things. But once you learn basically how, I always like to understand the nuts and bolts. Why does it work? And it just really helps people. A lot of people with PTSD said, I don't know how they would have gotten through the trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder without tapping. So it's powerful, but again, it addresses the meridians, and there's so little talk about meridians. And to me, it's
we're going to give you a chance, Debbie, to talk about them in a couple of weeks. Any other questions before we terminate tonight? We have a few more minutes. Anybody?
I've got a comment that kind of relates to what Debbie was just talking about. And since the late 80s, I've been doing reflexology, and I had the privilege of having Dwight Byer being my teacher on one of the weekends that I did. But there's a spot, it's in your foot and in your hand, right in your thumb, and that soft part of your thumb, and if I can hold my hand just right, that's the adrenal reflex. And if you want to just take your right hand, put it over on your left, put that thumb in there, and just move that around with a little pressure, and I guarantee you it'll hurt.
Yeah.
You can do the same thing on your foot, right underneath the big toe, and start working on that, and just work it and work it and work it. That's the adrenal reflex, and boy, I'll tell you, that'll make a huge difference in relieving stress.
There's also endpoints of the meridians in the foot, so that's part of what's happening as well.
Yep.
All right. I've got one last thought, and it's something I stumbled on while I was preparing for this, and it's a bit of it shook me a little bit. At least 14 of the school shootings that have happened in the U.S. are children or young people, sometimes young adults, who are on SSRI medications or coming off of it for depression. And if you could close your eyes and imagine a world where people were taking Climax instead of SSRIs.
Define that for people.
Selective serotonin uptake inhibitors, I believe.
Yeah.
If you could imagine a world where people are taking Climax instead of those, there might be fewer deaths.
But even the antidepressant effect, because I just saw a documentary about going back to several years of school shootings, and they said, yes, they were all on this or that or this or that. And so what popped into my head is, if people could just clean up their diet and understood what their high carb diets are creating. They're creating the depression creates the need for the medication makes them so they don't think quite right, and then they they do these things. So it all goes back to what Galen's all about.
Yes. Yes.
Sadly, 26 out of the 27 shooters, males, were fatherless families.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Emotions,
Love.
right?
Love.
Yeah.
Not to say that less guns wouldn't help, but that's just another point of view.
Or less access to guns.
Less guns, period.
Well, true, but
Look at our country and Britain and Australia compared to what's happening down south. It's so sad. Anyway, any other last comments or questions before we wind up?
Get a golden retriever.
There you go.
I have one. They're amazing.
Bad one.
Yeah, well, I'll show you mine if you show me yours.
Mine died 3 years ago.
Well, mine too.
Yeah.
So next week we're going to be all on the treadmill talking, right, Ken?
Yes, sir.
With our tank tops on.
So
Yep.
I can't wait to see that.
Wearing a tank top. John, yourself,
Sorry?
you're going to be wearing a tank top, right?
Yeah, of course.
We need ideal and tank tops.
So, so just now that you brought that up, so next week, same time, same station. It's exercise the week after that. Debbie, do you want to be on the week after that with yours?
Yes. Tell me the date that would be.
So that would be
14.
14th of March.
Should be good.
Okay, very good. And then if you guys want to consider doing one on sleep, that might be a terrific additional one to do before the end of March.
And I understand Charles is going to chime in.
I'm gonna be talking to him tomorrow and see if he can start participating, and relieve some of your time commitments. And good. Anything else? Last comment before we shut down for tonight? Yeah, Debbie.
I have one.
Yeah, go for it.
You were talking about meditation. Well, one of the most fun forms of meditation is coloring, adult coloring. I have been doing it for over 2 years now, and honestly, nothing matters when you're coloring. And you don't have to color in the lines. You can be creative. There's no rules. There's no wrong way. It is, well, it's proven to be very, very meditative in nature and very helpful for people with all kinds of stress conditions and mental health issues and stuff. So I do it just because I love it, but it is very, very calming, and it's pretty easy.
Well, for me, all my life, it was always building mechano models, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did that when I was a kid too.
Mind.
Yeah?
Yeah. Anything that takes your mind off of what you have to do, right?
Yeah.
Puzzles.
Puzzles, okay. Crosswords as well. Okay, guys, it's a minute before 6. Let's wind it down. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming on. Let your friends know that this recording is going to be on all the Facebook group pages later on tonight, and always on Debbie's YouTube channel, which is everything stem cell and carb management.
Right.
Thank you for that, Debbie.
Okay, then.
You're welcome.
Thank you, kid.
All right. See
Good
you
night,
guys.
all.
Good night.
Good
All
night.
right, guys. Thanks a lot.
Recording is stopped, and no. Recording is stopped.